welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. National security-related headlines are dominated by the ongoing war in Ukraine. On Wednesday, March 2nd, the Clements Center for National Security, Asia Policy Program, LBJ School of Public Affairs, Strauss Center for International Security and Law, and the Intelligence Studies Project, and the Center for Russia, East European and Eurasian Studies at the University of Texas, Austin, hosted an event, War in Ukraine, an expert panel and discussion. The panel of experts included Will Inboden, Executive Director at the Clements Center, Bobby Chesney, an Associate Dean and Professor at the Law School, Stephen B. Slick, Director of the Intelligence Studies Project, Sheena Greitens, an Associate Professor at the LBJ School and the Founding Director of the Asia Policy Program, Jeremi Suri, the Mack Brown Distinguished Chair for Leadership in Global Affairs, Alexandra Sukalo, a postdoctoral fellow at the Clements Center, and Zoltán Fehér, a predoctoral fellow at the Clements Center and a former diplomat from the state of Hungary. The discussion is wide-ranging and insightful. It offers evaluation of how the war fits into the history of foreign policy. It offers insight of it from the perspective of Russian society. It offers legal analysis. It offers an analysis of it from the perspective of stability, democracy, and deterrence. And it offers the perspective from Eastern Europe. This discussion helps you to make sense and to contextualize the headlines that are flooding our news feeds daily. Let's listen in.
Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is an event of enormous geopolitical consequence. It's the first interstate war in Europe since the Second World War, shattering the post-war European order, leaving us very uncertain about what the future world order will look like. As we look at the news and social media and talk to our Ukrainian friends, our hearts are gripped by the unfolding humanitarian crisis as hundreds of thousands of refugees are displaced. If you're like me, the image of ordinary Ukrainians standing up to the Russian military to defend their young democracy spurs outrage and a desire to do everything I can to help. We're here today because one of the most important things we can do is to help shape U.S. foreign policy and our response to this crisis, which is a global crisis now, over the coming weeks and the coming years, out probably to the next presidential election, in fact. And to do so, we will need to answer several questions. And I'm very grateful that we have our expert and talented panel of UT faculty to share their wisdom with us today as we address these questions. One, what does the Ukrainian government need now? And what will it need as the conflict progresses? How are the US and European nations responding to support Ukraine currently? And how should they anticipate future Russian actions? How will Russia's emerging alliance with China affect things in our foreign policy? Of course, this involves questions like how should NATO react and what role should the US play in NATO's response? While helping to lead the global response this far, the United States faces very difficult policy choices in the days and years, and maybe decades ahead. The LBJ School is honored to help convene this panel and to share our expertise. In addition, I want to very much thank our other event co-sponsors, the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, the Strauss Center for International Security and Law, the Clements Center for National Security, and two special Clements Strauss programs, the Intelligence Studies Project and the Asian Policy Project. So I look forward to our panel. Will, I'll invite you now to introduce our panelists. Thank you all.
Thank you very
much. But before I introduce my fellow panelists and set a little bit of the scene for our moment today. Given the profound numbers of civilian casualties already and the agonizing levels of human suffering going on, it's been suggested, I think entirely appropriate, that we begin with a short moment of silence for all of us, wherever you come down on the particular policy issues, to acknowledge the human suffering going on right now. So please join me in a moment of silence. Thank you. Well, it's great to see all of you here today. I think it's telling about, again, the gravity of our moment and the tremendous campus interest in this that with just a few days' notice, we were able to pull together such a great group of panelists and such a tremendously engaged and large audience here. So thank you to all of you. None of us know exactly how this is going to play out. We're going to be talking about that, but I do think it is safe to say, as a historian, that we are living through a truly momentous geopolitical shock right now. You will be telling your kids and your grandkids about all this. The world will not look the same once this is all done. What that will look like, we'll be exploring today. But this already we can see with the revolution in European security affairs, with the dislocations in Russia and Ukraine, that this is going to be one of those hinge points, one of those fulcrums in history. So I'm going to introduce our panelists here. Each of us will be speaking, making just 5 minutes each of introductory remarks. I shall be ruthless in enforcing that 5 minutes, and as is my little stopwatch here. But to show you the range of great expertise we have, all drawn from here on campus, all drawn from our faculty ranks. Immediately next to me, we have Professor Bobby Chesney, Associate Dean of the UT Law School, Director of the Strauss Center for International Security and Law, and one of the country's leading experts on cybersecurity policy and on national security law. And he'll be talking, and a lot of other things too, and he'll be talking about those today. He's also a regular consultant to many senior national security officials in U.S. government agencies. Next to him, we have Professor Jeremi Suri, who is the Mack Brown Chair in Global Leadership here at UT, both in the History Department and the LBJ School. He's one of our generation's most accomplished and prolific diplomatic and political historians. And again, his insights are regularly summoned by decision makers in Washington and the military and the intelligence community. Next to him, we have Professor Steve Slick. Usually when I introduce Steve Slick, I will say something like he brings 3 decades of CIA experience to us, and as a man of precision, he quickly corrects me that he brings 28 years of CIA experience. So anyway, Steve was a CIA case officer. He began his career in East Berlin during the Cold War when there still was an East Berlin. He may or may not have crossed paths there with a young KGB officer named Vladimir Putin. Steve also served several years with helping to stand up the CIA station in Kyiv in the 1990s. So, and then he ran and oversaw intelligence programs at the White House and in the Bush administration National Security Council. And he is also a faculty member at the LBJ School in addition to running our intelligence studies project. So next to Steve is Zoltán Fehér. Zoltán is a doctoral fellow with the Clements Center, currently doing his doctorate at the Fletcher School at Tufts. But that's not why he's with us today. He's with us today because he previously spent 12 years as a Hungarian diplomat with the Hungarian Foreign Ministry, played significant roles in Hungary's integration into NATO and addressing Hungary's post-Cold War foreign policy. So he'll be bringing a Central European perspective. And then next to him is Dr. Alexandra Sukalo. She is also a doctoral fellow with the Clements Center. She previously served as a Eurasian military analyst with the Department of Defense. She has lived and worked in Ukraine for a number of years doing research there on Soviet intelligence activities in Ukraine, which I'm told is a matter of some relevance, and in addition to her linguistic and scholarly gifts. And she is about to join the faculty of the Naval Postgraduate School. And then finally is Dr. Sheena Greitens, also an LBJ faculty member, the director of the Asia Policy Program. While Dr. Greitens' primary expertise, well, she has many zones of expertise, is Asia policy. And so part of what she'll be talking about is what does all this mean for Asia, especially for the future of Taiwan, for the Russia-China relationship. But she's also done quite a bit of very good work on personalized dictatorships, on information operations. And again, as with many others, she's a regular consultant to policymakers and intelligence professionals in Washington, D.C. So we've got a great group here. Like I said, we'll each be sharing our initial framing comments. We'll have some discussion among ourselves. And then after that, we'll have time for questions from the audience where we'll ask you to come up to the microphone that will be placed there at that stand in a little bit. So let me shift from moderator role into now my speaker role here. And I speak as a former policymaker myself, but also as a historian of American foreign policy. I'm just going to make 3 main top-line points. And it starts with this. When you hear Vladimir Putin's rather deranged justifications for this invasion of Ukraine and his grievances against the United States and NATO and the EU and the West, he will often focus on what he wants to interpret as decades of American misdeeds towards him and his country. He'll cite a litany of grievances such as the Kosovo intervention in 1999, the Iraq War, the enlargement or expansion expansion of NATO, and a general pattern of American disrespect for Russia. And he wants to make the case that justifies his aggression here. Those episodes I mentioned, those all happened, right? Kosovo happened, Iraq happened, and the Russians didn't like that. And so without downplaying that those were complicated episodes and the Russians did, certainly did have, some warranted differences over this, I want to give a very different narrative to you about the last 35, 40 years of US-Russia relations, all of which is also true. But the point here that I want you to take away is Putin is inventing a lot of grievances as rationalizations for naked aggression, okay? And part of the problem here is he chooses to see threats where threats do not exist. So here's another narrative, again, all factually based, of the last few decades of US-Russia relations. Since 1985, since Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in March of 1985, every US president, from Reagan on up through the present, through Joe Biden, Republicans and Democrats, has attempted to engage with the Kremlin and has pursued two positive policy agendas with the Kremlin. The whole goal has been inviting Russia into the community of nations as a prosperous, stable, peaceful and responsible great power. Each of these presidents pursued two overarching outreach goals. First, partnering with Russia to reduce the size of the American and Russian nuclear arsenals. And then second, supporting Russia in moving, again, into a more open and pluralist, prosperous economy and society. And the reason I start that with Reagan, usual narratives start with the end of the after the Cold War, is yes, Reagan wanted to collapse and destroy Soviet communism. He did. But he also wanted to affirm the greatness of the Russian nation. And he wanted to disentangle Soviet communism from Russia as a historic civilization and a nation. So that's why he spent, his 4 years of diplomacy with Gorbachev trying to put out positive inducements, trying to say, look, if you can move past this oppressive Soviet edifice and recapture Russia's traditional strength, you can join the world economy, you can have a more prosperous, peaceful, stable society, and we will partner with you to reduce, if not eliminate, our nuclear arsenals. Every president since Reagan has followed that path. When Clinton worked to bring the Russians into the G8, which is supposed to be the world's most elite club for industrialized democracies, it had previously been the G7. By any objective criteria, Russia did not belong at the time in the G8, but as part of this American embrace of bringing them into these international institutions, of treating them as a great power. When the Bush administration, following the Clinton administration, brought Russia into the World Trade Organization, when we partnered with Russia on the International Space Station, so on and so forth. This is not to say that there haven't been major friction points between the US and Russia. There have been. But the overarching American strategic imperative across the last 4 decades and multiple bipartisan presidents has been embracing Russia, treating them more as a friend than as an adversary. And you will not hear that narrative from Putin, but it's important to see when he tries to pin this aggression on the United States. Second, what were the results of a lot of those policies? Well, it didn't necessarily improve things for Russia themselves because of choices Russia made, but if we had a map up here, and we don't, but if you look at the Russian border regions, the Russian rimlands from the Asia Pacific across Central Asia over into Eastern Europe, if you look at Russia's border regions, you'll see that over the last 2-3 decades, the most stable, prosperous, peaceful, Pacific neighbors Russia has had have been to the west of Moscow. It has been those EU countries. It has been those NATO countries. They've not been the ones poisoning, tank regiments and nuclear-tipped missiles targeting Moscow. That has been a region of peace and prosperity. Contrast it with Russia's south. What they have? Iran, a terrorist-supporting, nuclear-aspiring state. Afghanistan, say no more there, right? And then if you look again over to the east, Russia borders North Korea. Again, not your idea of a good neighbor. Russia has improved its relations with China. Sheena will talk about that. Again, that's a historic source of instability. Where am I going with all this? It's that these Western policies, I think, on balance, have actually been good for Russia's own security and economic interests in the West, and yet Putin chooses to see threats instead, when in fact, if he took a more objective look, it would be a better situation. Finally, last point. Why, given this picture, why is he now invading Ukraine? Well, I think there's really 2 things. First of all, he doesn't just want it as a neutralized buffer state, a security zone. That's a fiction. He tosses it out there as part of his information operations to get Americans fighting with ourselves and blaming ourselves. Rather, he wants to control it as a vassal state. He wants it to be a new colony. He doesn't even recognize it as an autonomous nation. And he certainly does not want it to be a democracy. And why does he think he can get away with this now? Well, sadly, because he has gotten away with this for the last 20 years, whether his manipulation of the Ukrainian political system with the Orange Revolution in 2004, his invasion of Georgia in 2008, his attempts to assassinate his political opponents both at home and abroad, his seizure of Crimea in 2014, his intervention in in Syria to support the genocidal dictator Bashar al-Assad in 2015, his meddling in America's elections in 2016. From where you sit, if you're Vladimir Putin, each of those worked and you didn't pay a price for it. And so when you decide now in 2022 that you want to take Ukraine, you can see how there's been a failure, again, a bipartisan failure of deterrence there. Why? Because the United States was still stuck in our let's be friends with engaged Russia mode. And so there's a profound paradigm shift going on in the American posture right now. And I think it's high time we highlighted some more of this history rather than letting Putin set the agenda with his grievance narrative. So, all right, enough from me. You can see I have some strong opinions on this. Up next, Professor Suri.
Thank you, Will, and I'll just follow from where you brilliantly closed off. I want to begin by thanking all the staff members from the Clements Center and the Strauss Center and other centers who put this together on amazingly short notice. And I want to thank all of you for being here. Showing that you care is one of the most important ways in which we need to respond. Vladimir Putin is presuming we won't care. We didn't care enough when he invaded Crimea. We care more now. And it's incredibly valuable that you are all here. You are part of the solution by being here. So thank you all for being here. I'm going to talk about a few things very quickly, just building on where Will left off. I'm going to address these particular questions. Why does Ukraine matter? Why should we care? Why did the vision of a common Europe, a phrase used both by George H.W. Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev, and also Helmut Kohl at the end of the Cold War, why has a common Europe failed to reach fruition in our current moment? Why did deterrence fail? Why were we unable to deter Vladimir Putin? And then finally, in the remaining 3 seconds, where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? So why does Ukraine matter? Ukraine in the first half of the 20th century was the cockpit of some of the worst recurring brutal violence in the world. By some estimates, more than 40 million Ukrainians, many of whom were Jewish, were killed either by Russians, Soviets, or Germans. And we could throw other perpetrators in there. This is the center of Europe. It's the natural crossroad between East and West. It is the breadbasket for much of the Middle East today, as well as for Russia. It is an area that, going back to the 17th century, was disputed territory between many of the major empires in Europe and in what we would call the Middle East today, if we include the Ottoman Empire. And so for that reason, it was the center of conflict through the first half of the 20th century. One of the most important commitments that all of the belligerents made at the end of World War II was a commitment to keep that part of Europe peaceful. Never again. No more war in that area. So even though Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union against its will, there was a very strong consensus, East and West, including Soviet leaders and American leaders, that this area was to be free of war. That is one of the reasons why Vienna is peacefully reunited in 1955. That is one of the reasons the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe in 1975 drafts the final act, as it's called, of the Helsinki process. This is all keyed around one fundamental presumption for security, East and West, Soviet, American, and European, in the post-war order, which is that this cockpit of recurring violence and conflict cannot see that again. And that has held until this moment. We can talk about the invasion of Crimea as being an inching toward a violation of that. But what we saw 5 days ago, was an explicit affront, a breaking down of that firewall that has been the foundation for 70 years of unprecedented peace in most of Europe. That's why this matters for us. This is the most important geopolitical threat we have seen, more important in many ways than the 9/11 attacks, if you think about the future of the world order. Why did a common Europe fail? Mikhail Gorbachev, George H.W. Bush, Helmut Kohl, at the end of the Cold War, had a vision that many shared of Europe coming together, a wider EU that would include Russia to some extent. That Europe was built around something a little different in many ways from the United States. It was built around democracy, it was built around free enterprise, but it was built around, most importantly, what Ralph Dahrendorf, the great European statesman, called a model of power sharing. that within societies and across societies, business leaders, political military leaders, unions, which are very strong in Europe, at the core of the European economies, and students who are unionized in Europe and have a great deal of say in their societies, might seem radical to all of you, that political military leaders, business leaders, unions, and students would share power, that there would be multiple power centers, and that Europe would be built around national and transnational power-sharing arrangements. This was proposed for Russia as well, and Boris Yeltsin went down that road partially. Vladimir Putin, from his first days in office, rejected that. His regime is built around non-power sharing. And so that's why a common Europe has failed. There are differences on politics on many issues, but if you have one large actor that refuses to share power, it is very hard to build a power-sharing system across the continent, and that is largely why Russia has been excluded from many of the institutions that it could have been a part of, including the G8 for a while, if it were willing to share power. Why did deterrence fail? Why did deterrence fail? Many of us on this panel have spent years studying and writing about deterrence. It's one of the most studied topics. Thomas Schelling, one of the leading thinkers of the early post-war years, whose work is then used by Henry Kissinger, they share, I think, the central insight that deterrence works not based on how big your hammer is, but how credible you are in using it. Credibility, or as Henry would say, credibility. Credibility is actually at the core of deterrence. I can make big threats, but if no one thinks I'll follow through, those threats are not deterring anyone from doing anything. It is the ability of NATO, through most of its history since 1949, to put together a series of military, political, diplomatic, economic, and cultural measures that both incentivize adversaries to work with NATO, but also deter challenging borders that NATO would actually have trouble defending on a day-to-day basis. Since the 1950s, there have not been enough soldiers in NATO to actually push back a true, full Soviet or Russian offensive. It has been deterrence that has kept this area free from those outcomes. Why did deterrence fail? Well, I think we have to look at ourselves in the mirror on this one. It is difficult, Tom Schelling wrote 70 years ago, to deter when you are not united, when you are not clear on where you stand. The threat that leaves something to chance, Schelling wrote, only works once in a while. It only works a little bit to be a poker player. What works more is consistency, unity, and a focus on using your resources for clear goals that are shared by your society, your allies, and your leadership. And I'm sorry to say, when we have an administration that trashes the very alliance, as the prior administration did, that is trying to deter, it makes it harder for that alliance to deter. So all of those who were trashing NATO in the United States 2 years ago are responsible for undermining our deterrent capabilities. And I'm sorry to put it so clearly, but I think that's the case. So where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? Well, I think I'm sorry? Quickly. I said 10 seconds, right? You know, as a historian, I always study the past more, and then the future I leave to people like Will and others, right? Where do we go from here? First, we need to come back to this idea of a common Europe. We need to move back toward power sharing, building institutions that are better at sharing power across societies, giving more people a stake in their society, more Europeans and Americans a stake in the world order we're in. And we have to rebuild our deterrence, and we've started to do that the last few days. That doesn't just mean building more arms and moving response forces as we must into Poland and elsewhere. It means that we as a society must do what we are doing here. We must speak out strongly on behalf of the position NATO has taken since 1949, which is that borders should not be changed in Europe by force, and that one large country should not have the right to invade and conquer another country. And we must live by that ourselves, which means also no more Iraqs, as well as no more Ukraines.
Thank you, Professor Suri. Professor Greitens.
Thank you, Will. And let me echo the thanks that have already been offered to the organizers of this event, as well as to all of you for being here. The stakes of the current moment are incredibly high, and I'm glad that we were able to have this conversation here at UT. I wanted to make three main points, mostly focused a little bit less on the strategic backdrop of the current moment and a bit more on understanding what we've been observing in the noise and the fog of war, and to try to pull out a signal from that on some things that I think are really important about the way that the initial period of this conflict has unfolded. The first has to do with the what I would call Western information dominance, and in particular, the sort of unexpected and pretty remarkable success of the Ukrainian government's information strategy to date. I think it's remarkable not just because of the memes that all of us have been seeing in the current moment, but because it's actually tied to very clear defensive strategy on the part of the Ukrainians. And because of that close tie to their strategic objectives, I think it has literally reshaped the global response and probably ultimately some facets of the global order. President Zelensky's addresses, particularly those that have been given in Russian, have been particularly aimed at debunking the central claim that Putin and the central pretext that Putin has used to launch this invasion and this war of aggression, which is that it was about protecting native Russian speakers. Right? And so there is a very, very calculated and important message that is being sent in those moments. The use of the Ukrainian military's use of what I call the call your mother strategy, where prisoners who are being not only treated well, but told to call their mothers who were told that they were on training exercises, not participating in an invasion. And so trying to use that, again, to undermine the information barriers and the information control that the Russian regime has tried to put in place in order to degrade public support for the war inside Russia and to get alternative narratives out that are beyond Putin's control. So yes, the war has in some ways been one, I think this is perhaps the most quotable war of the last several decades. But the strategy is about much more than the memes that we've all seen on Twitter or Reddit, wherever you're getting your information. I will say the announcement last night from the Ukrainian tax authority that tax seizures are that the seizure of Russian tanks is not a tax reportable asset, particularly got my attention. Right, this is a very, very smart and whole of government information strategy that has been really remarkable to watch unfold. But it is, I think the important point for us to take away is how closely it is tied to the strategy that the Ukrainian government is using at home vis-a-vis the Russians and in the international space to try to achieve its continued survival. The second point I want to make is that this is a case where the pathologies of personalist dictatorship are driving a tremendous amount of the way these events are unfolding. It's affecting those dynamics, the dynamics of this conflict, in at least three very significant ways that I can see. So in contrast to the Ukrainian government's approach to the information space and information strategy, I think it's pretty clear that Putin went into this conflict with a highly flawed understanding of the information space in which the Russian military and the Russian sort of foreign policy apparatus would be operating. It's pretty clear by now that he significantly underestimated both Ukrainian nationalism and the will of the Ukrainian people and government to resist the invasion. So I think it's, personalist dictatorships have particularly bad problems with information they don't like. And so that's really played out here. The second way that it's played out is that it's translated directly into battlefield performance. The Russian military was sent into an operation where it was not prepared for the political objectives of the conflict it was asked to undertake. And so there's a serious political military disconnect in Russian strategy right now, and we don't know where that's going to go. But again, I think the call your mother, the appeals to Russian soldiers to defect, to surrender, are all aimed specifically at this problem on the Russian side and trying to use it to defend Ukraine's sovereignty and survival. The third point about personalist dictatorships is not an optimistic one. It's harder for Vladimir Putin to find an off-ramp. Personalist dictatorships often end violently, and Putin at this point is going to have a hard time finding an off-ramp that doesn't cost him tremendously in terms of regime security and his own personal security at home. That's part of the 2/3 of dictatorships fall to insiders, to their own elites. And that's part of why you see him sitting at these tremendously long tables. But that also, again, that is going to lead to flawed battlefield decision-making because he's not getting accurate information either inside Russia or about the battlefield itself. So it's worth testing whether there's an off-ramp that he's willing to take, but it's honestly very, very difficult because of the structure of the regime he himself has created to find a pathway that would be acceptable, given the maximalist aims that he's laid out. The third point I want to raise is China's role in all of this, because going into this conflict, the United States was attempting to reorient itself for geopolitical competition with the People's Republic of China. And I think what we've seen here is a China that has been off balance or unbalanced. We don't know exactly what happened in the early February meetings between Xi Jinping and Putin, but there was a sort of a renewed diplomatic statement of alignment. And I think this conflict, just as it has not been what Russia expected, it has probably not been what China expected either. And I think that explains some of the frankly tortured diplomatic language that we have seen, refusing to call this an invasion, reaching really Orwellian proportions by the people who are at the podium in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Beijing, appeals to legitimate security interests. Oh, wait, we don't mean Ukraine, we mean Russia. And the abstentions that we've seen at the UN, including the one this morning, which really puts China in a fairly small group of countries in the international community. So again, it's worth testing, and the United States having serious private conversations about whether Beijing is actually willing to redefine its interests in a way that's compatible with the global order that's being tested at this very moment. But I admit that I think the pro-Russia lean is pretty clear here, and I'm frankly not optimistic. And that is something that we're going to have to grapple with for decades to come. Finally, and I promise, Will, I'm almost done. The US and China are both watching this, as much of the rest of the world, to see what lessons each side could and should learn as it relates to a potential Taiwan scenario in the future. And I can talk a little bit about why this has been, the Chinese language on this has been so contorted, because I think some of that has to do with what they're anticipating precedent setting being for Taiwan. And let me just say here, I don't think we know what lessons the United States should draw or that China should draw yet. We're too early in the consequences unfolding to really know what lessons to take away or what lessons Beijing will take away, because they might not draw the same conclusions we do. I think they'll be watching at least three things. First of all, what are the implications of the way that Ukrainian resistance to invasion has unfolded for the hardening of Taiwan and the defense of Taiwan? This has been a serious conversation, but also a point of tension about what Taiwan's defense strategy should be. And so obviously, I think in a maritime rather than a land war context, there'll be a lot of questions and analysis done on that. The second is about coalition responses, right? The remarkable pivot that a lot of European partners have made, including Central European countries that previously, were not as anti-Russia in their orientation, has been pretty amazing. What does that mean for what a diplomatic response to a Taiwan crisis might look like? And then the third is the economic consequences. China, I think, and people in Beijing are watching very closely the impact that the sanctions that have been applied have had not just on the global economy, but on the Russian economy specifically, and are going to draw lessons and try to harden themselves so that they don't pay those same costs in a future Taiwan scenario. So I think it's really important. This isn't a story that has been even close to 100% written yet, but those are the three things that I think we should watch and that China will be watching going forward for a potential future crisis. Thanks.
Thank you. All right. Professor Slick, Steve Slick.
Yeah, terrific. Thanks, Will, for the invitation to join the panel today. I'll be brief, and I'll also stay on script. That's for your protection and for mine. Will, absolutely. My perspectives on the Russian invasion are indeed shaped by the 2-year assignment that I had to Embassy Kiev in the mid-1990s. This was shortly after the collapse of the Soviet Union and Ukraine's direct declaration of independence. That was a time, I can recall it vividly, of great hope and opportunity for Ukrainians. Ukraine was the third leading recipient of U.S. foreign assistance in the world, and we were there vigorously helping them transition to democratic governance and a free market economy. Now, my job was there to establish a CIA presence and support the changes that were underway in Ukraine's security sector. And on reflection, I have to confess, we didn't make as much progress as we had hoped for. Most of our ambitious plans were thwarted by what I refer to as a split identity that characterized then and characterizes now Ukrainian society. So, for example, the civilian security service that I worked with, and whose badge I'm wearing on my lapel today, was very pro-Russian, strongly influenced by Moscow, while the military intelligence service, to the contrary, was pro-Western and heavily nationalistic. And over the succeeding decades, I've watched closely as pro-Russian and pro-Ukrainian governments have alternated leading the state. Now, the most significant hurdles to Ukraine's development over these 30 years, in my view, are that split that underlies much of the tension in Ukrainian society, and also the crippling level of corruption that they've suffered from amongst business leaders and government leaders. It touches virtually every aspect of Ukrainian society, and that's been a real handicap for them. Now, to my area of interest and expertise, intelligence, this conflict has presented some serious challenges, but also great opportunities for American intelligence. And I'll mention three. You see the pattern here? This is government briefings. I'll mention three intelligence issues that I'm following, one from the past, one from the present, and one in the future. So in the recent past, the Biden administration has been regularly disclosing and talking publicly about U.S. intelligence on Russia's plans and intentions. Now, ordinarily, any intelligence we might gather on President Putin's plans and intentions would be held quite closely and used to inform U.S. policymaking. In this case, though, President Biden's used the information to disrupt Russian plans, keep our allies engaged, and also remind the American people that this conflict is quite serious and might well impact them eventually. Now, of course, whenever you talk about sensitive intelligence information, you run the risk of endangering the sources of that information, both human and technical. On balance, I think the administration's handled this issue quite well. Policymakers have clearly worked closely with the intelligence professionals to calibrate these releases to achieve the policy impact while still protecting the sources. And these are sources that we're going to need in the future. Now, a present intelligence issue, something I'm reminded of every morning when I reach for my phone. So there's certainly a large number of task forces and fusion cells and watch centers all over Washington, D.C., focused on Ukraine at the moment. The intelligence questions range from strategic to tactical. Now, the one that I've been most surprised by is the fact that the Russians, either before or during this invasion, did not take down Ukraine's internet, or did not yet take down Ukraine's internet. And that means that they're executing their invasion in front of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of smartphones, or as I would call them, intelligence sensors. So every morning, my news feed is full of fresh images of Russian convoys, spent missile casings, military vehicles stuck in the mud, hospital emergency wards, and endless refugee flows. There's, of course, tremendous intelligence value in all this detailed, real-time information. And when the fighting is over, I'm going to be curious to learn how well our intelligence community collected, sorted, and exploited this torrent of information. One of the biggest challenges facing U.S. intelligence right now and in the future is how to cope with this volume of what we call open source intelligence. This large-scale ground war in the heart of Europe should be an interesting test for any intelligence service that's trying to mine that data for intelligence insights. So that's something I'll be watching. And lastly, to the future. Now, we don't know yet how this conflict will end, who will control territory, and who will govern Ukraine. But if the result of the invasion is a military occupation or the installation of a puppet pro-Moscow regime, it's clear that much of the Ukrainian population is prepared to resist for as long as it takes to restore their independence. The question will immediately arise in that case, how much and how the United States should support an anti-Russian resistance movement in Ukraine. There would be enormous risk involved for the states on NATO's eastern flank that would be pressed into service supporting an effective insurgency. And if the U.S. were to support a Ukrainian resistance movement, there'd be a strong incentive to do so covertly to prevent any direct contact between NATO and Russian forces. This would be a tremendously consequential decision for a US president and an extraordinary difficult task for the CIA, which in our government is responsible for executing these kinds of presidential guidance. Now, the most obvious Cold War analogy that we'd reach for would be the CIA program launched by President Carter in 1979, within weeks of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Now, we're still in the military phase, but the fighting will end either through conquest or through negotiations. And if Russia succeeds in displacing the legitimate Ukrainian government, discussions in Washington will inevitably turn to how the US should help Ukrainian patriots reverse that outcome. So watch this space. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, and thank you for sticking to the time, too. Dr. Sukalo.
I just want to reiterate the comments of my fellow panelists. Thank you to the organizers of this event for pulling it together. As a historian of Russia and Eastern Europe, I have to admit I'm thrilled to see so many people having an interest in the little corner of the world that I've dedicated my life to learning about. However, I wish, of course, that this was under completely different circumstances. My heart is just breaking for the people of Ukraine right now. I want to focus my remarks specifically on the rhetoric that Putin has used to justify his invasion of Ukraine and to trace it back and try to understand the historical context of where this is coming from. So last Wednesday, Putin, in a fiery television address to the Russian people, announced that through a special military operation, Russia would begin the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. And this, of course, precipitated his attacks on Ukraine. Now, the demilitarization part we can talk about, and to me, that's potentially a little less interesting. Now, denazification is quite interesting. So as many of you know, Ukraine's current president, Volodymyr Zelensky, is Ukrainian. Ukraine's past prime minister under Petro Poroshenko was also Ukrainian. And I think it's important to point out that Putin claiming that there is a fascist cabal in Ukraine is not an aberration. Beginning in the Maidan Revolution in 2014, that saw the removal of Viktor Yanukovych, who was the Russian-backed president of Ukraine at the time by the Ukrainian people. They ousted him. Putin began this rhetoric, and he's increasingly amplified it over the past couple of years. And he uses this idea of fascism in Ukraine to divide Ukrainians along both ethnic and religious lines. And I do think it's important to point out, however, that anti-Semitism does exist in Ukraine. I don't want to downplay this. Historically, the Ukrainian population has had a troubled relationship with the Jews that live in the Ukrainian territory and that are Ukrainian, beginning with Catherine the Great in 1791 and the founding of the Pale of Settlement, which saw a third of the European Jewry living in Ukrainian territory. This mass concentration of Jews led to pogroms and discrimination. In the Second World War, of course, when Ukrainian partisan groups allied with German forces under Stepan Bandera and the ONUB movement, they capitalized on anti-Semitism that existed amongst the population to carry out pogroms against the Jewish population. However, Putin is vastly overblowing this idea that there's some sort of insider threat within the Ukrainian government. And in the 2019 election, approximately 2% of this united nationalist bloc, this is the far-right bloc of Ukraine, had any sort of electoral support. So it's clearly not what he's stating. So where did he come up with this idea, and why did he think it would sell particularly to Russian domestic audiences? So it comes straight out of Joseph Stalin's playbook. After the Second World War, when the Soviet Union was trying to reclaim the Ukrainian territory and was meeting with fierce resistance by Ukrainian partisans, the political police records, that is the Soviet Domestic Intelligence Service, in arresting people and executing people, frequently and liberally defined them as being fascist and Nazi. This is not to say that that entire section of Western Ukraine was overrun with Nazis. It wasn't. But what happened was there was a logical fallacy that developed where, because the Soviets had lost so many men and so many women and so many children to the Axis powers from the Axis powers and the Nazis, if you were anti-Soviet, it must mean that you were Nazi. And so this is sort of the roots of that idea. Now, Putin considers himself to be an amateur historian. If any of you are aware of that, he's been writing frequently articles about Russia's relationship to Ukraine. He's rewriting sort of the origins of the Second World War, placing most of the blame on Poland. And he uses historical myths to undergird his regime. And the Second World War in particular plays a key role in Russia's ideological offensive and serves to legitimize Russia's great power aspiration abroad. And he thinks this will sell to the Russian population. There is no question in my mind that Putin sees a more Western, liberal Ukraine as an existential threat, and I think that's very important to acknowledge. His calculation has been that Soviet revanchism abroad will distract from the growing socioeconomic problems that he faces at home. So in 2018, because of the crippled, Russian economy, excuse me if I'm saying Soviet, it's the historian in me, the Russian economy, Putin delayed the age of retirement for the population, which was met with fierce protests. In 2020, in eastern Russia, in Khabarovsk, there were mass protests after a legitimate election, a candidate Putin then cited for assassinating people and removed from office. And then he's been very closely watching the developments in Alexander Lukashenko's Belarus from 2020 to 2021, when mass protests attempted to overthrow Lukashenko for illegitimately claiming the election as his own. So there's no question that Putin has big problems at home. And he thought, my argument would be that he thought this would be an easy solution. He would go in, he would cite the Ukrainian political leadership as being Nazi. He would decapitate the leadership, the Ukrainian people, with this unifying Soviet myth of the Great Patriotic War, the Second World War, would buy into it and find themselves the Mala Rossiya, that he thinks that they are these little Russians. And the reality is, of course, is now he's slogged down in Ukraine, and this whole, it's hard to sell that when you're bombing civilians, and we're seeing this refugee stream. So I think I'll just end it there.
Thank you, Alexandra. Bobby Chesney.
Thanks, Will. So I'm going to talk about the legal issues primarily, although I'm going to turn around at the end and talk a little bit about the cybersecurity policy aspects as well. So first, the legal issues. And I want to start with the most important issue, which also turns out to be a pretty easy issue. Was it lawful for the Russians to attack Ukraine? If this is my classroom, I would wait for someone to put up their hand and hope that you would all say, no, Professor, that's an easy one. But let me unpack it a little bit, because the Russians do have their argument, and it's important to understand why their argument fails. First and foremost, the UN Charter, Article 2.4, prohibits the use of force in violation of the sovereignty or territorial integrity or political independence of other states. It is the legal linchpin of the international order of the rule of law that's characterized the post-World War II period. So how in the world does Russia purport to comply with it, given what they're doing? They have two arguments, neither of which holds water. First, and I would say, and this is a legal term, ridiculously, it has tried to claim that Ukraine was going to attack it sooner or later, and that this is just anticipatory self-defense. And of course, making that argument, they relish the chance to sort of gesture towards America and Iraq in 2003. There's nothing in any way even halfway serious put forward to support this. It's just a word salad that's being thrown out there. Their more serious argument is a complex one that begins with their purported recognition as independent sovereign states to so-called people's republics, breakaway regions from within eastern Ukraine. That's step one. Step two is those newly recognized pseudo-sovereigns then say, we have an imminent threat from the government in Kyiv, and we call on Russia to aid us in collective self-defense. And so they kind of turn it around, make themselves the victims, and then the Russians come into the country in the exercise of collective self-defense. Now, let's set aside the fact that the conditions that even begin to set the table for these separatist regions in the East are entirely bound up in the already existing Russian violation of Article 2.4 that occurred in years past with the Little Green Men intervention and ultimately the seizure of Crimea. Even setting that aside, the whole argument holds no water, because whatever else might be true, even if it were otherwise a credible argument, A, it was a violation of Ukraine's sovereignty to purport to recognize breakaway regions to begin with. That's not how this works. And B, even if there was a legitimate, newly independent region that had its own self-defense claims, the rules of the UN Charter and the international system are such that your response, even in collective self-defense, have to be necessary and proportional to the threat that you're responding to. The conquest and indeed destruction and toppling of the government of Ukraine is not necessary or proportionate or anything like that. So these arguments hold no water. We have a gross violation of the UN Charter here, but it's worse than that. It's not just a violation of the UN Charter. It's what the Nuremberg Tribunal termed a crime against peace. It's the crime of aggression. And I will simply quote here from the famous final judgment at Nuremberg, where the International Military Tribunal wrote, "To initiate a war of aggression is not only an international crime, it is the supreme international crime, differing from other war crimes in that it contains within itself the accumulated evil of the whole." I think that says it better than I could say it, so I'll leave it there. Now, let me just note in the interest of time that there are many other legal issues and emerging and potential legal issues as well. Perhaps most obviously, staying with the war crime theme, there is, as Steve mentioned, the flood of open source information. There seems to be a lot of reason to think that a great deal of indiscriminate targeting, that is, targeting that is not limited to military objects or objectives, but rather either recklessly or even intentionally targeting civilian objects and civilian population, seems to be occurring. Now, for all war crimes, including the cardinal crime of aggression, but also attacks on civilians or violations of the rules of proportionality with collateral damage, for all these things, it's worth bearing in mind, Russia's not a party to the International Criminal Court, but Ukraine is, and the Russians are doing this on Ukrainian territory. It is within the jurisdiction of the ICC, for whatever that turns out to be worth. That'll depend on other things down the road. Interestingly, the United States and many others are supplying combat materiel, javelins, anti-tank weaponry of various kinds and other things. We're doing a great deal of this. Is this lawful? It is. We are providing it at the request of the sovereign government of Ukraine on its soil. There is nothing legally problematic about that. The only interesting questions are policy questions. Putin has made over the past 24 hours increasingly loud statements that the Russians will begin to treat these weapons transfers as acts of participation in hostilities by the transferring countries. And we are seeing some effects of that. Some of the nearby nations are beginning to get very uncomfortable with weapons transfers crossing their territory. That's a worrying sign. That's a worrying sign that not everybody, we're all denouncing what's happening here, but it's a bit of a fracturing in what has been a pleasantly aligned alliance response here. Backing down on the transfer of weapons because the Russian saber rattle is a worrying sign. And if many people begin to defect from that alliance solidarity, it makes it vastly harder for everyone else. So keep an eye on that space. I've been talking international law. What about U.S. domestic law? Is it okay for the United States to be providing the support that we are providing without some sort of action by Congress? Yes, if we were to actually get involved in combat operations directly, which the administration has said we are not going to do, but if we were, I think that would be a different kettle of fish. We've done a lot of things under color of the post-2001 authorization for use of military force following the 9/11 attacks. It has no application here. There were administration lawyers testifying in Congress this morning affirming that fact. That's not even a close call. It clearly has no application here. There are positions the executive branch lawyers of both parties have long taken over the past several decades about the extent of executive branch discretion to do what we might call things below the threshold of war without congressional express approval. But putting our forces into combat hostilities with the Russians, it's pretty widely agreed. That's above the threshold. You'd need congressional action to do that, but no one seems to be calling for that at this point. Now, might things escalate? Let me turn here quickly in the interest of time to say something about cyber operations, because if we were to see escalation that would begin to pull us in more directly, that is one possible pathway it could happen. So far, all the commentary in the sort of intersection of international relations and security studies and cyber operations studies has mostly been along the theme of haven't seen as much as we thought maybe we'd see here. There hasn't been as much in theater. There's been some, but it's no surprise we're not seeing the Russians using more destructive cyber capabilities within Ukraine for a variety of reasons. But most of all, because when you can drop a missile or drive a tank over to disrupt something in the old-fashioned way, that actually makes a great deal more sense than it does to use a precious cyber capability, which then will be seen and understood and guarded against in the future. So I'm not terribly surprised the Russians aren't heavily relying on cyber capabilities in theater. The threat that they will use it out of theater to impose costs on us, the way that we are imposing costs on them through economic sanctions, is a very real threat. We've escalated sanctions up pretty far. There's plenty of headroom above that, to put it in amplifier terms. There's still room. You can go up to 11. We're nowhere near 11 yet. But we could get there, and one of the reasons why we are proceeding more gradually has a lot to do with the fact that though they cannot effectively economically sanction us back, they can use destructive cyber capabilities and are holding that threat over us. We could escalate in kind. Is that going to happen? We shall see. There's a game of chicken going on here. They have not tried to play that card yet. We're not helpless against it, but they have tremendous capabilities, and geography drops out of the picture at that point. So we may see some of that. Let me just stop with this observation, though. Let's assume that both the White House and the Kremlin and others concerned are, in fact, correctly gauging the cyber escalation risk and mercifully for the whole planet are keeping a lid on attacks on critical infrastructure outside of the war zone. That doesn't mean that all the actors are accounted for. On all sides of the conflict, there is always some amount of enthusiasm by private individuals or groups to get involved in conflicts. And we're seeing some of these stories in this conflict as well. But what we're now also seeing is the potential intervention of private actors and entities in the cyber domain. On the Russian side, Russia is haven to the world's greatest concentration of ransomware crews and other cyber criminals. Some of these have begun issuing public statements of support for the Rodina. The Conti group, which is a particularly problematic ransomware actor, has specifically threatened to go after Western infrastructure. Meanwhile, the so-called hacker collective Anonymous, so a Western sort of decentralized leaderless resistance type thing, purports to be going after Russian infrastructure. And some Ukrainian authorities have put out English language calls for hackers around the world to do what they can against the following list of Russian civilian, governmental, and business targets. So if there is escalation that results in things that have real practical disruptive impacts in the United States, if I had to predict, I'd say that follows from situations that spin out of control from the non-state actors, which may or may not act with state approval in some cases, but spiraling up out of the non-state actors' aggressive actions. And that's the world we live in now. So let me stop there.
Zoltán.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I have the grateful role of speaking last, but I'll try to do the best. Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you all for coming and showing interest in this very important question. And before I speak as an expert, I'd like to say on a more personal note, as a private person, especially as a Hungarian, that I stand unequivocally with the Ukrainian people in their fight for their freedom and independence. Back to the so-called Central European perspective, I'd like to speak about the perspective on the conflict from my own backyard. And I'm going to start with, the smallest portion of that, which is my home country, Hungary, and then zoom out from there to Central Europe and then to the European Union. I didn't start my clock, sorry. I'll watch the time.
I started mine.
Hungary has played an interesting, in my perspective, very shameful role in the lead up to the conflict in actual European Russian policy in the past decade under the leadership of Prime Minister Viktor Orban. Orban has been called the Trojan horse of Vladimir Putin inside the European Union and NATO. He's built a very close alignment with Putin in the past decade, especially since 2014, both politically, economically, in energy deals. He struck a deal with Rosatom, the Russian nuclear energy company, to build a second power plant in Hungary, a multi-million dollar deal. He's been signing back-to-back deals on supplying gas with Gazprom. And in 2019, he went as far as welcoming the move of the Russian-backed International Investment Bank, which we call Spy Bank, into Budapest. Their headquarters moved to Budapest. And we believe with good reason that the bank is full of Russian intelligence officers. But more importantly, Hungary has really followed Russian interest in undermining the European aspirations of Ukraine. In 2017, the Hungarian foreign minister pledged to block and veto every measure in the European Union that would advance Ukraine's European integration process in the framework of the so-called Eastern Partnership, of which Ukraine is part. They've done the same in NATO. So Hungary bears great responsibility for not having, not helping unity within the European Union and NATO, but I'll talk about the EU in a minute. So zooming out from Hungary to Central Europe, Putin hasn't only courted Hungary, but has also courted the other Central European countries with some success, but not as much success as with Hungary. He's had some success with President of Czechia, Miloš Zeman. He's had some success with the former Prime Minister of Slovakia, Robert Fico, but both Czechia and Slovakia have in recent years moved away from their formerly pro-Russian stance. And Poland, the Baltics, and Romania have been staunchly anti-Russian, anti-Putin in their foreign policies. So zooming out further to the European Union, because the European Union's role in this conflict, the lead up to the conflict and hopefully its resolution is very important. And the European Union has been the main partner of the United States in responding to this unlawful aggression against the Ukraine. The EU has not had the most stealthy record when it comes to dealing with Russia, managing Russia, containing Russia. This has a lot to do with the de facto leader of the European Union, Germany. Germany has had a very wishy-washy policy on Russia. Gerhard Schröder, the former chancellor, who struck many deals with Vladimir Putin, still sits on the boards of several Russian energy companies. Angela Merkel has also had a very two-faced policy towards Russia. She had the tough talk, but she never walked the talk. Finally, there's a turnaround with Olaf Scholz, the new Social Democratic Chancellor of Germany. Under pressure from the Biden administration, there's a definite turnabout in German policy. Chancellor Scholz has recently suspended the Nord Stream 2 pipeline project, which is practically finished, but he had to back down from that. That's a Russian pipeline project together in cooperation with Germany. But the invasion marks a turning point for EU response, as we've heard before on this panel. The EU has really stepped up to help Ukraine. It's revised its policy. It's forged a unity among its members. The EU is now sending arms to Ukraine, unprecedented step. It's imposing very harsh sanctions on Russia. It's matching the same sanctions that the United States has imposed and has proposed to its partners around the world. And the EU has recently stated that it will welcome Ukrainian refugees for 3 years within the European Union's member states without applying for asylum. And the surprise turn of the past few days, even Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orbán, has changed his course. He couldn't stand the pressure from both the population and also his Western partners, the United States and in the EU. He's changed his tone and fallen in line with EU response. I believe it's only tactical. And finally, there's a really important development in terms of European Union response. But I do want to say that Orbán is still two-faced. He's the one who indicated that Hungary will not send arms to Ukraine or let any arms pass through Hungary that are sent to Ukraine. Finally, President Zelensky has recently requested an immediate granting of EU membership to Ukraine, and now we have 9 Central and Eastern European countries of the European Union backing that. Even Hungary backs that. And I want to quote the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. Ukrainians, they belong to us. They are one of us, and we want them in.
Thank you very much, Zoltán. Elizabeth, are you able to do the mic here? And while Elizabeth or Paul is doing that, lightning round for our panelists. I want each of you, we're not going to ask anyone to actually predict the future here. We all agree that's a murky enterprise. Each of you, Sheena, we're going to start with you and just work on down. Tell us one key factor or variable that you're going to be watching closely over the next few weeks that you think will be dispositive, important for how things play out. I'll put mine out first. My big question among many I'm going to be watching is how much will these sanctions actually cripple Putin's ability to wage war? Right? Waging war is profoundly expensive. It's hardest in the best of times with a healthy economy and access to capital markets and so on. But between the sanctions, the asset seizures, the crushing of the value of the ruble, just the ability to continue, paying for rockets and bombs and planes and tanks and so on and so forth, let alone the salaries for your demoralized troops, that is not anything he can take for granted. They're already feeling some pain. How much that will continue? That's going to be one factor I'm going to be looking at closely going forward, among many others. But Sheena, over to you, and then we'll just work our way back down.
Putin puts a tremendous amount of importance on some of these grander historical projects that the panelists today have outlined really well, but he's also ultimately very, very careful about his own personal security and regime security. And so I'll be watching to see how events in terms of the military operations in Ukraine, but also all of these aspects of the international response translate into regime security and pressure on Putin personally at home.
Thanks. All right, Alexandra?
And I will be focusing on the Russian people. Navalny is no longer active. He's in prison and will be arguably for the rest of his life. And I'm curious to see if there will be the next Navalny. There are protests going on in Russia now. But I think that speaking to regime pressure, that if there's a sizable Russian population, that some of these oligarchs, some of Putin's inner circle could feel the pressure for themselves and say, maybe this is time that Putin now has led us down a dangerous path we can't return from. And so I'm really focusing on Russia.
Thanks. All right. Zoltán?
I believe that President Putin has seriously miscalculated on several fronts. The first of which is obviously the military operations. He underestimated the Ukrainian resistance. I think the planning for the military operations was inadequate. He seriously miscalculated the response from the world. He underestimated the response of the European Union, his friends and allies within the European Union, including Hungary. This crisis is really going to threaten peace and stability within Russia and his own regime. Unfortunately, I'm really expecting right now a very protracted conflict with a lot of blood on both, the Ukrainian and the Russian side. So I'm not very optimistic about the outcome of the military invasion itself. I'm a little more optimistic that this has already changed the politics of Europe. It's changed the foreign policy of several countries. And I think this invasion is really undermining Putin's power at home.
Steve,
very
what
quickly,
you're watching for?
Very quickly, the treatment of Kiev. I think he has military options. He can either attempt to enter and destroy the city, which would have enormous ramifications because of the historic sites and symbolic significance. This is where Volodymyr the Great accepted Christianity on behalf of the Slavs. This would be literally a Rubicon, to mix my historic metaphors, if he crossed the Dnipro and set about to destroy official buildings in in Kiev. He has an alternative. He can lay siege. He can start negotiations. If he destroys Kiev, I think this is literally a turning point.
Jeremy.
So Russia has a long history of major regime change, beginning with the military, and not in a coup, but in a series of military desertions and military departures from the authority in power. So I'm watching how Russian soldiers respond, how the Russian military responds, and I'll throw one other out there. We haven't talked enough about China. This is more Sheena's bailiwick than mine, but I think China is Putin's only way out right now, either through escalation or through departure. And so I'm watching closely China as well as the Russian military.
Bobby.
I'll just repeat something I closed with, which is watch the activities of both the Russia-based ransomware crews. If they start getting reckless in destructive operations, it's going to compel a response, and we'll be in a very difficult escalation situation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.